We're going to get started here. We have folks online, and we'd like to welcome them. Also, we'd like to welcome all of you. We have a mix of alums, current students, and we have a couple that are prospective students. And we welcome you all to our first and inaugural Magis session for the Masters of Science and Leadership program. I'd like to recognize Dr. Joyce, who's on the call this evening. Thank you, Mary Ellen. She has this vision. And so I want to say a couple words and then we'll introduce our speaker this evening. But at her direction, she sees this vision of pulling people together, and this is one of those events. We'd also like to thank our folks with enrollment management, Dr. Capitelli, or soon to be Dr. Capitelli, also Marisol Godinez, who's out in the foyer. They both have put this on, and also John Ahern, which is my assistant. He's here actually to learn, as I am too. But we'd like to recognize those individuals and kick this session off. These sessions are framed as signature formation touch points for the MSL program. These are planned to be every fall and spring semester, and they're designed to highlight the Ignatian dimension of leadership, which includes the notion of courage, consciousness, care, and conviction. They're meant to be reflective and energizing moments that bring the community together around a deeper purpose of the MSL program. Tonight's session is our first session on courage, appropriately designed. It's a starting point for any authentic leadership journey, and it sets the tone for everything that you will encounter in the MSL program or are encountering. And I can look at a student back over here, Sheila, and an encouraging moment and her navigation. I won't go into details, but I'm very proud of her and for her pathway, but also for each one of you. I've had many of you in classes, including Mandy, and just like to recognize you for your journey here. This is not about me, but I just wanted to touch bases with you all. We're going to start off, and we're going to start off with Dr. Greg Noone. Dr. Noone brings a rich mix of military, a retired Navy captain. I'd like to point out that I have two sons that are in the Air Force, and they're not captains yet, and I know that's a lower rank in the Air Force, but nonetheless, high level in the Navy. I've done a lot of naval research, and so I understand the importance of a captain. Also, he's been in the legal field and also ethical leadership, and he brings those experiences to our faculty. Dr. Noone has been teaching with us. Also like to recognize another faculty in the room, Dr. Bent. Thank you, Lauren, for all your support. Both of them have been key faculty in the program even before I started in 2000. Back to Dr. Noone, his work on courage asks students to consider not only what they do as leaders, but who they become. It's a natural fit for him to launch off this series. Dr. Noone, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for those the Zoomers at home. It's always a pleasure to be here at Boston College among friends, colleagues, and some current students who are just finding out for the first time they have legs. Because when you get to know people on Zoom, you're unsure of heights and everything. So it's nice to see everyone. I was asked to come tonight to talk about courage and how it relates to Ignatian leadership. For those of you who've had my class or have my class now, Sheila, you missed last night, but we talk a lot about Ignatian leadership. Come on in, just on time. Look at that. And we talk a lot about where this fits in to the larger picture of leadership, to the larger picture of courage. Obviously, we talk a lot about other types of leadership and courage. Right now, going through the courage in our class, we have Jim DeTurt's book on workplace courage. We use Stretcher's Life on Purpose. We have John F. Kennedy's. It was a young writer, up and coming. John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage, and then Martin Luther King's famous letter from Birmingham jail. But really, what we want to do is relate it to our own selves, because the reality of it is that all of us have to exhibit courage. But when we think of courage, we often think of the firefighter running into the burning building, which is, in fact, courageous. We think of the young Marine out on point on a mission in the middle of wherever. That is courageous and takes courage. And we think of people who are speaking up, truth to power, maybe in a whistleblower situation. And that, of course, takes courage. Those were all courageous acts, to be sure, and they're easy to agree on. Um, my mother always used to say, if the world was black and white, it'd be so easy, but the hard things are in the gray. So the fact of the matter is that all of us can be courageous, and all of us have been courageous, but kind of the same way that we talk about leadership, and we'll talk about it here in a moment. It doesn't have to be a big event. It doesn't have to be a life-changing or life-saving event. We talk about leadership being something that you do 15 seconds at a time. Courage is the same way. So we'll go through and we'll talk a little bit about our courage and what I call Ignatian courage as well as Ignatian leadership. So we'll give you a quick overview for tonight. So we're going to talk about what courage is and what leadership is. And I put those in quotes because they mean different things to different people. And then we'll talk a little bit about St. Ignatius of Loyola and Ignatian leadership values, and then the 4 pillars of Ignatian leadership and courage, and then wrapping it up with kind of a summary of the two. So tonight, I think the theme is I forget the actual title is something like In the Arena or The Man in the Arena, right? So I went out and I grabbed the Theodore Roosevelt quote, the famous Theodore Roosevelt quote, and there it's much longer. This is really only not even half of it, but it is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, and it continues from there. A friend of mine is a basketball coach, and he was getting a lot of heat from the media, and I sent him this quote, and I said, "Hey," and I just shot it to him on a text, and he wrote back, "I read that quote every day," and I'm like, "Yeah," because that's apropos of where we are. So I wanted to put that quote up there to kind of officially kick off the title of the actual course itself. But go ahead and we'll talk about that. So what is courage? And a couple of famous quotes up here. Courage is the mean between fear and recklessness. Aristotle. Courage is knowing what not to fear. Plato. I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. Nelson Mandela. And then we kind of shift gears a little bit here, because instead of focusing on fear, we start focusing on courage and how it impacts all of our virtues. Courage is the most important of all the virtues, because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. Maya Angelou. And lastly, courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point. C.S. Lewis. Now, you could Google, cool quotes about courage, and you'll get a million of them. But I think the last two are pretty important. I mean, the idea of taking on fear, and again, it doesn't have to be the fear of your life. It doesn't have to be the fear of confronting an attacker or confronting the enemy on a battlefield. It can be the fear that some people are gripped with when they have to go to a meeting and speak in front of a group. It can be the fear that people are gripped with when they have to commute each day because they had a bad experience on the T. So fear comes in all different shapes and sizes. Come on in. Yeah, there's a surcharge for being late. Come on in. Come on in. Just put your dollar in the bucket. So, go ahead. So let's look at the scenery. Let's look at all of his emails. Let's screen again. Now we get to see what you've been working on. See, now you're.
This is my fear.
Yeah, I know. I shouldn't be. That commercial where the guy's like all his pictures from his holiday are up on the screen and nobody can help him. All right. Okay. So let's start with leadership, because going back to this idea that leadership is something that happens 15 seconds at a time. Let's talk about that, because then I think courage fits in nicely, because it really is hand in glove here. So we all lead, whether we do it well or whether we do it poorly. We all lead 15 seconds at a time, whether you know it or not. It's your daily interactions, and every single interaction can convey respect or it can convey disrespect or aloofness. So how you interact with the barista at Starbucks, how you interact with the person who empties your rubbish bin in your office. As I like to say, do you know their name? Do you know how many kids they have? Do you know how long they've been working at Boston College? Because my guess is it's probably been a while, and they've probably been doing your trash can for quite some time. But how you interact with that is really where leadership is. It's not the big speech. We talk, famously, I love Winston Churchill. The quickest way to get in a fight in a pub in England is tell them that the greatest Englishman that ever lived is half American. So Churchill is one of my favorites. And the famous speech about, we will fight them on the battleground, we will fight them in the streets, and so on and so forth. He's trying to motivate the English people, and they're at a pretty down point, right? I mean, Europe has just been taken over by Nazism, and England's next. And so he's trying to rally the people, right? He takes over right before the evacuation of Dunkirk. They were hoping to get 30,000 men off the beach. They got over 300,000 men off the beach. It was phenomenal. But this is when he takes over the leadership, and he talks about how we're going to rally. So he's got two audiences. He's got his audience, the English people, and he's got the world audience, particularly Hitler. That speech that we have made iconic in our history lessons was not heard by many people live. So we talk about these big speeches, but then it really didn't play out the way that we have mythologized it in history as to when he said that. So it's often not the big speech. It's not the big speech at the big shareholders meeting, or the big speech at commencement, right? It's how you interact with someone in the elevator. It's how you interact with someone in the parking garage. And we're all super nice in parking garages, right? My dad used to joke how we'd leave mass, and then people coming out of the parking lot were all like ready to kill each other. Like, we're in church like 40 seconds ago, and now we're ready to kill each other in the parking lot because that guy's in my way. So it's how we interact with one another. And for a long time in the military, I believe that leaders are born, and that was that. And I believe that you could improve a little bit on people's leadership skills, but either you had it or you didn't have it. It took me a lot of years to realize that's not true. And that really is a personal choice when we look at leadership, and how we can take that potential and we can either build on that potential, or we can sit back and say, you know what, I just don't have it. And you can sit in the chair and remain silent. Or you can lead, whatever that means, whether you're leading a small group of people whose English is a second language and you're trying to convey to them that this is what we need to get done, or whether you're standing in front of, the executive team of your company, or here at Boston College, trying to convince them why we should do X or Y, right? So it's a personal choice, and it's the way to unlock that potential, but not just in you, but in the others around you. We talk a lot about leading by example and leading others by example, and the idea that you have to develop the best and the brightest talent. It's up to you as a leader to develop that talent. And the true leaders create leaders, not followers. There's something that we'd say in the military when a leader would take the best assignment, and we call it skimming the cream off the top. And that guy would be known as a cream skimmer. So someone would say his name, and be like, that guy's a cream skimmer. And everyone knows what it means. It means that he took the best assignments for himself, and then you did whatever it is that, the crumbs, the scraps that fell out. Where the leaders who actually set their people up to succeed, to grow, to become the next generation of leaders, they're the leaders, right? That you're deepening the bench, and you're developing that talent that will be there long after you're gone. Because sooner or later we all have to retire, whether we'd like to or not. We all have to retire. Somebody else has to take it over from here. And so, have you done your job when you're ready to go? That's really at the end of our careers. Guys like Tristan and I are both turned 39 this year. At the end of your career, you have to start looking at what your legacy is, and your legacy is who you've left behind to take over after you have to move on. Find ways for your subordinates to be personally self-motivated. Yelling at them and cajoling them probably doesn't work. How do you motivate them to understand the motivation that they need to work internally that will get them to move? And lastly, find support and trust the leaders you lead, especially those on the ground. What I mean by that is there's a thing that we see all the time. See the guys at headquarters think the guys out there are all screwing up. And the guys out there think the guys back at headquarters don't know what they're talking about. So there's this constant push and pull. And so whether you view it in the military sense or whether you view it in a satellite campus sense, however you view this, whatever analysis it takes, but there's always some main office and there's always some ancillary office, right? You got to trust those guys and support them and build that relationship so that they understand that the headquarters has their back and recognizes that they're the ones closest to the ground truth of where they are, and that has to be respected. Okay. So looking at our leadership, we go to our man here. I give a lot of talks in front of military units and RTC units, and when I do my leadership talk there, I open it up by saying that these are the leadership lessons of a combat wounded veteran. And then of course they all start thinking of different images in their head. And I tell them about Saint Ignatius. Saint Ignatius trained his whole life for warfare. He didn't even bother to learn how to read and write. Trained his entire life on how to kill people. And a bit of a womanizer too, to be fair. And it's not until the battle in 1521 when a cannonball shatters his right leg and wounds his left leg pretty severely as well, that he's done. He's now a combat wounded veteran who can't read and write. And it's through this long recovery, through this process, and ultimately a pilgrimage, that he starts finding there are other things in life than killing people and womanizing. He teaches himself how to read, learns how to write, and then by the time we get from 1521 to 1540, he's appearing before the Pope and asking for the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, to be recognized as an order. So it's a pretty remarkable conversion that takes place in this short time period. But what St. Ignatius understands is building a team, and he understands the importance of education. So we talk about some of these Ignatian leadership values, and these are all things that St. Ignatius and the early Jesuits developed as part of how they're going to do business. Now, many of you know these, so I don't have to go through each and every one of them. But certainly, when we talk about caring for others, when we talk about calling upon leaders, Majesty calling upon leaders to create a more just and humane world. When we talk about, yeah, there you go. Then when we talk about how I always abbreviate AMDG, but that's how that's how I text it when I text it to people. When I write it in my notes. So when we talk about focusing on serving a higher purpose with an orientation towards the common good. And lastly, women and men for others, pursuing social justice for all persons. And then contemplatives in action, promoting the develops of moral character and self-awareness, which we'll talk more about this habit of reflection. We talk a lot about it in class. For those of you who've had me and have me now, we talk a lot about reflection. I love these classes here at BC. There's always a handful, about a third of the class are always athletes, right? Because they're on their 6th year, 5th year, COVID year 9, whatever, I mean, the eligibility. I'm like, you look like you're older than me. Still have eligibility. For athletes, it's kind of easy. They don't realize it at first, but it's kind of easy. They all watch film. Everything they do is they're watching film. They're watching the game film. They're watching the practice film. It's all about watching film. And I'll say to them regularly, what do you think that is? That's a form of reflection. You're looking at how this play was executed. You know what you're supposed to do, but you did something different. And now you get to reflect on, do you do the different thing, or do you think you're supposed to do, or do you do some third option that you were supposed to figure out? So this idea of reflection. In my class, we have reflection that I ask everyone to do every day. And then in the midway point, and then at the final point, I ask them to turn in some of their aha moments, right? I don't want the whole thing. I just want some of the big aha moments. And I was talking to some folks last night. We were kind of reviewing about how the course went and what would you change, what would you keep, along those lines. And one of the things that I didn't bring up, but I'd forgotten to bring up was the fact that I take the reflection points, the midterm and the final, and I give a lot of points for those because I'm trying to demonstrate how important everyday reflection is. I mean, if you just make it 4 points, then it's going to be worth 4 points, right? But if you make it, 15% of the overall grade, well, now we're talking about the difference between an A and a B, right? So, try to motivate as best I can through the use of points. But this idea of reflection is so powerful, and it runs through everything that Jesuits do, and everything Saint Ignatius talked about. Finding God in all things, being stewards of creation, responsible for the world in which you live, and discernment encourages leaders to employ critical and integrative thinking to solve complex problems. I will also talk about the commitment to learning and growth. You know this. The Jesuits have conquered education. Right? There are more Jesuit institutions around the world than any other religious order or any other religion, period. Right? I was we were talking a couple of weeks ago. I went to Villanova. Right? Villanova was one of the few Augustinian schools, but we got the Pope. And so the concept of education obviously is important in the Augustinian tradition, but nobody did it like the Jesuits, right? I mean, pretty much every Catholic school is a Jesuit institution. Yeah, sure. There's the Holy Cross Fathers and a couple Augustinians and a couple Dominicans and sprinkling here and there. But the Jesuits understood, and I will say this: Pope Leo just came out with one of his writings. I forget the technical name. I almost want to say encyclical, but I don't think that's right, but maybe I'm wrong. Talking about the value of education, talking about how we must educate and we must take education seriously and we must continue to push it forward. This is something the Jesuits have done for a long time. And Ignatius knew this right out of the chute. He knew how important this was. So, the famous IPP, and if you've had me in class, you know what this is. If you haven't had me in class, you still may know what it is. But this is where I start taking the leadership concepts of Ignatian and start combining them with the courage. Because the IPP speaks courage to me. So you know what the 5 are, right? Context, experience, reflection, action, evaluation. Why am I doing what I'm doing? But now put them in a context, put them in the relationship to where courage fits in. So for context, are you honestly seeing reality as it is? Are you taking an honest assessment and figuring out the context? The experience. We need to understand our internal movements, our biases, our fears, our ego. Reflection, that contemplation, discernment, values, motives, and the greater good, led to action, taking the courageous steps to do what's right. And then lastly, again, that evaluation, examining the choices, improving upon it the next time we go on. To me, as we started talking more and more about courage and preparing for this lecture, I started thinking more and more that this is kind of the turning point for where all the courage comes in. Right? We have these understanding of these values and these leadership values, but the IPP really is where the rubber meets the road when you start looking at Ignatian leadership and Ignatian courage. So one of the things that I love, and this really, this breakout comes from Christopher Lowney's book on heroic leadership, which I think is a fantastic book. It's required in my class, and the biggest feedback I get is from the students who went to BC undergrad. The biggest feedback is, I wish they assigned us an undergrad. I want to know more about why we're here, what we're doing. And this actually came out of a conversation from Goodman back in November of 2018. And when I came on campus to meet with the dean, and my name had been put in to teach this class, and so he wanted me to meet him, which is absolutely what you need to do. You listen to any leader anywhere, and they will tell you the most important thing is hiring, period, full stop. Hiring the right people. If you don't do that, all the other stuff you're doing isn't going to work. So I came in to meet him, and we were having a great conversation. And he's actually the one that gave me the Lowney book. He's like, have you read Christopher Lowney? And I said, no, I have not. And he goes, you really have to read it. I think it'd be really helpful in this class. And I was taking over a class from another faculty member who taught it completely differently. So my task was to revamp the course, to change the course, to make it practical and relevant based on my experience. And the Lonnie book fit in perfectly. I was in Kenya this summer working with the Ministry of Foreign and Diaspora Affairs in Kenya on a long-term project that I've been working on for a couple of years. And we were at I was in line for the July 4th party at the ambassador's residence. And and I obviously was invited because I'm an American from military, and so that was easy. But for the locals, it's a really big invite. It's a really big invite. And I was talking to some of the people online, and one of the gentlemen that I struck up a conversation with is a professor at Kenyatta University, which is one of the most famous, biggest universities in Nairobi. And so we got talking, we were talking what we were doing, and he said, I have 75 young people from across Africa coming in next week for a week-long program. I would love for you to come and talk to them about leadership. It's a program about leadership. So I said, sure, happy, I'd love to. And so what did I talk about? Talk about this. Talk about Ignatian leadership and this very four simple ways of viewing all of this. And so let's look at these from the leadership perspective, and then we'll look at them from the courage perspective and see how, as I said, it's hand in glove and how it fits. So self-awareness. So cultivating this habit of self-awareness, cultivating this habit of reflection, how important that is for each of us to do it, to understand our strengths and weaknesses, and in the Jesuit tradition, to do it initially, right, in the 30-day initial examine, and then doing it daily and learning from those mistakes, but assessing your daily impact each day. We all do that. We've all done that, maybe just not as formally, right? I mean, we're always thinking about something that happened, on the taxi or the Uber home from an event, and you say, "Oh, I should have talked to so and so, or I should have said that to so and so." I think Sheila will appreciate this one. One of my favorite terms is taxi cab humor. It's a very British term where you think of the really funny thing you should have said at the party on the taxi cab ride home, So there's reflection in serious ways and minor and comical ways as well. But it's this idea that we formalize this a bit more and implement what we learn from it. And then ingenuity. And this is innovating and adapting. So ingenuity really is important to kind of figure out how we take this potential and turn that vision into a reality. And I love this line, we live with 1 foot raised. It's one of my favorite lines from Ignatian. Living with 1 foot raised, just that concept of always being prepared, being ready to step forward, being ready to move. My man St. Augustine talks about the world being a book. And if you haven't traveled, you've only read one page. And so it's the same idea, right? Igniting change. You have to be restless but rooted. And so that restlessness of living with 1 foot raised and being ready to take action. And then practice indifference, not indifference in the way that we use the term today, indifference, like almost as a negative, but indifference and understanding that we have the freedom to be unencumbered by material things, to be unencumbered by biases, to be unencumbered by ego, to experience new ideas, to experience new cultures. And then the next one here is love. And this is something that when you first read it, you kind of go, really, love? That's what we're talking about, love, right? But this is about showing how much you care for the people that you're with and that work for you, and that you demonstrate that you have their back and you have their best interest. I've told this story to my class, but Joe Mazzola started coaching the Boston Celtics a couple of years ago, and early on in his tenure of his first year, Jaylen Brown went to the line with 0.1 on the clock, 0.01 on the clock. He had 2 shots, 2 foul shots. Celtics are down by 1. Jaylen Brown, he's going to make them both, win the game. Go team. Well, Jaylen Brown misses the first one. Okay, make the second one. We'll tie. We'll go into overtime. He misses the second one. And the media immediately goes after Joe. What did you say to Jaylen Brown? with this implication that Jaylen Brown lost the game, forgetting that there were 47, 59.99 other minutes in the game, right? That somehow he lost the game. And Joe Mazzulla, and I can tell you, I've known Joe for 15 years. He and I go back a ways. Joe Mazzulla said to the press, and what I say and what my wife says, most Joe Mazzulla thing ever. He said, I told him that I loved him. And the press went, what? Press lost their mind, right? They absolutely lost their mind. I said, what does that mean? Joe said, it means exactly what I said it means. I told him that I loved him. And there he was exhibiting to Jaylen, which is true. I know Joe calls these guys all summer, out of season, off season, on breaks. He's on the phone with these guys, checking in with them. But he demonstrates to them on a daily basis how much he loves them. So do you think that those guys would do more for him or less for him? Because he knows how much that he cares for them and how much he has their best interest out for them. So it's not a sentimental love. It's a true bonding. It's an understanding that you can support your people in a way that they know through thick and thin that you're gonna be there from. And lastly, heroism, which is kind of not heroism like the running into the burning building heroism, but the heroism of energizing themselves and others with heroic ambitions, the magis, right? And shaping the future rather than passively standing by and waiting to see what happens. The idea of committing to a way of life, focusing on goals greater than oneself. So the AMDG, right? And now let's look at these construct that Lonnie has given us, which is straight out of Ignatian's ideas and thoughts. Now let's look at it through a courageous lens. Let's look at it through a courage lens. So let's go back to the top and look at it through courage. So courage as self-awareness. What I've termed Ignatian courage. I should be a little TM there with a circle, right? We'll trademark it later. But the idea of knowing what you fear and why. What is your fear about not speaking up at a meeting? And oftentimes that fear is real, right? I mean, it's I'm afraid of getting fired. I'm afraid of ridicule. I'm afraid of being isolated, right? So it's just better to keep quiet, go through, and not stick my head out of the foxhole. So we have to understand what your fear is and why, and understand your biases, your desires, where your blind spots might be. That's why diversity matters. Without diversity, you're going to have blind spots. If you're in a car full of people that all think and act the same way, you're going to have a blind spot. You need people who have different views of what's happening around you. And so Ignatius saw this as a precondition for all courageous leadership. You can't act bravely if you don't know what matters most. You can't discern wisely if you don't understand your own motives. You can't lead others if you can't lead yourself. Courage is the hinge that translates reflection into behavior and leadership. That's where courage sits in our self-awareness pillar. And then let's look at courage from ingenuity. Courage fuels ingenuity. The courage to come up with new ideas instead of just following the herd. Ingenuity is courage expressed as creativity. Ignatian sent these Jesuits out around the globe and told them to figure it out. I taught sailing in the summertime when I was a young high schooler into college and even into law school. And the man I taught with was a great teacher. He was a high school teacher in Dennis Sharmath High School down in the Cape, and he was a great coach. And one of his favorite sayings, and it used to annoy me when I was younger, was figure it out. Somebody would say, well, we can't, and he'd go figure it out. And I was like, geez, don't we need to give me a little bit more direction than that? Like, no, they'll be fine. Watch. And sure enough, they'd figure it out, right? And so we actually named one of the boats Figure It Out. But that's what he told the Jesuits to do, to figure it out, to go out there and conquer the world and figure it out. And they were going to some hard places, places that Christians had not been, into Japan, into China. They were going to some hard places. But here is the courage to try new strategies, to adapt to uncertainty and innovate out of mission and not ego. The mission is first, And that's what these men did. That's what the Jesuits did. They had to figure it out on their mission. Your mission is to go to here, talk to them about Jesus. And they had to figure out how to do that. But we need to figure out what our mission is and how we're going to be creative and courageous in figuring out what the next thing is beyond the obstacles, especially when you're facing ambiguous ethical and organizational challenges. Some organizations are just built wrong. They're built wrong, and then they have the wrong people in the wrong positions. And now you're sitting there going, this is awful. That guy shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be doing that as a collective. Why is that part of the mission statement? Right? So you have to have the courage to think differently and to think of ingenuity. I'm not saying go in and approach the boss at the board meeting. There are ways, and this is where your favorite book to turn is there are ways that he recommends doing it, right? Recommends doing it, and first of all, building your reputation, starting in a quieter space, keeping your emotions in check, and then kind of circling back on the reflection part. So no matter which kind of book you read about courage, it's all kind of the same thing we're talking about, right? It's that self-awareness, ingenuity, love, and then heroism. All right. So let's look at it from the love. Ignatius taught us that we have to have the courage and the willingness to accompany others and protect them. In leadership, courage means addressing conflict while preserving dignity, means being vulnerable enough to build trust, means caring enough to hold high expectations. And like I said, this isn't sentimental love. This is operational courage. That's what this is. You're shaping the culture and the leaders that we're going to create. And then lastly, on heroism, it talks about it not being individual glory, but the courage to pursue meaningful mission-driven objectives, inspire others to strive for magis, and take risks for the greater good. But it's not ego, it's where aspiration meets service. Heroism is acting with purpose, excellence, and courage every day, but it isn't flawless and it isn't fearless. It's understanding what you can do in the space that you're in. The best we can, we try to shape the battle space and try to make it reflect the way we want it to reflect, but sometimes we don't always have the power. Other people have a vote. In the actual battle space, we say that the enemy gets a vote because he does. You can come up with all the plans you want, but the enemy gets a vote. And usually those plans are destroyed in first contact with the enemy. All right. So taking those hand in glove, let's look at some of the concepts that we talk about in how do we put that in our daily lives, into our workplace, right? True leaders create environments that reward courage and don't punish it. Normalize dissent and question. One of the things that I've talked about with everybody that's ever worked with me. Look, people need to be heard. If we're contemplating whether or not we're going to do course of action 1, 2, or 3, if people have an opinion, they need to be heard and feel like they've been heard. And then the leader can say, I've taken in all the information. We're going to go with course of action number 1. But as long as people who were advocating for number 2 or number 3, as long as they feel like they've been heard, legitimately, not in a check the box kind of way. As long as they feel like they've been heard, then they're more likely to very quickly get on board with course of action number 1. Not simply because it's the boss, so I got to do what the boss says. Oh, well, this is going to be a failure. No, because you were heard. We talked about the pros and cons of each one of the actions, and then we move forward together. The leaders have to lead and have to make the ultimate decision. But people have to feel as though that they were able to give that input. And so normalize that dissent, normalize that questioning. The model of integrity and vulnerability. Leaders have to be the model of integrity. I was a long time ago. I was with a Navy admiral, and we were checking into a hotel. We were out on a mission somewhere, and we had to go to a hotel. And at the time, there was a lot of talk about we just been issued government credit cards. There was a lot of talk about the government credit card and how we had to use the government credit card on government travel. Then, of course, the restrictions, you couldn't use it for personal use, things like that, right? Simple, obvious stuff. So I get up to the front desk next to this admiral, two-star admiral, and I put down my government credit card to check into the room. He puts down his GMC rewards card to check into the room. And I thought, I will never look at this guy the same again. Because they're telling us we have to do it. And I was just a lowly lieutenant at the time, the equivalent of an Air Force captain. And here I am going, how about that? And if you think I didn't tell anyone, you'd be wrong. Because I went back to all the other lieutenants, go, you're not going to believe what happened. And they all went, how about that? Right? It might have been a little bit more colorful than that, but something along those lines. But you can't do as I say, not as I do. You actually have to lead in the same integrity that you're asking of everybody else. Create the culture where truth is safe. We are in a dangerous time right now where nobody knows what the truth is. The biggest problem facing this country is our source of information. People are getting information from sources that they already agree with instead of sources that they're designed to make you smarter and more knowledgeable about whatever it is you're looking at. People turn on Fox News or MSNBC to be validated. They watch Sean Hannity or they watch Lawrence O'Donnell because they're going to sit there and go, that's exactly, Mildred, are you listening to this? That's exactly what I've been saying, right? Well, I don't know if you know this, but after, I don't know the exact hour, 6 or 7 o'clock at night, Fox and MSNBC and all these channels, that's entertainment. They literally list that as entertainment. Tucker Carlson was sued for defamation, and the defense was, and I'm not picking on Tucker Carlson, but his defense was, nobody should believe me. I'm an entertainer. That was the defense. So it's infotainment. And the problem we have now is that people are selecting their own infotainment, and people can't even talk to each other because we don't have the same information. And the truth is getting slipperier and slipperier. How do you find the truth? Where is the truth? Who has the truth? Who's the keeper of the truth? You know, we talk about it as a lawyer in court, as an officer of the court, you better be speaking the truth. You better not be misrepresenting. Whether you represent the government or whether you represent a client, you better not be misrepresenting to the court what you have and what you intend to show. That's the quickest way to being disbarred. Well, the quickest way to being disbarred is stealing money. This is the second quickest way to be disbarred, okay? But the fact of the matter is, this is, I think, is one of the hardest things now. To actually seek the truth, want the truth, and encourage the truth in any environment you're in. Because we're in a very slippery time with what is the truth. And then doing the right thing is the norm and not the exception. Courage is not something you either have or don't. It's a skill formed through intentional practice. So you, as a courageous leader, create a workplace like this, and you're going to create the intentional practice of courage. So when it really is important that somebody say something because something's going to happen, that skill has been practiced over and over again, not waited till the last minute that some event took place and what would you do, right? I mean, isn't there a show where they stage something and they film the innocent guy and how he's going to react, whether he'll intervene or not, and then the reporter comes out and goes, I'm so and so from, and then they talk about how. What show is that?
What would you do?
What would you do? What would you do? So very creative name. What would you do? Right? So, and it's interesting watching the reaction, right? I mean, you have different reactions, but it's not something that we wait to practice. It's something that we should be practicing all the time and intentionally building a skill and not waiting on it. And then, in summary, this is my own version of Ignatian courage, trademark forthcoming. This interior freedom, right? From bias and from fear and status concerns, right? Action in service of others, this discernment that we go through under pressure, choosing the greater good and acting with integrity. Courage is the bridge between knowing the right thing and doing the right thing. And this is where Nation Courage gets us. Then I think I have one more slide, which, yes, then there's just in my legal doctrine of completeness. I have my summary for Ignatian leadership and some of the things that we've talked about as well. Consistently displaying ethical behavior, critically engage in self-reflection, lead, embrace and lead change in organizations and society as a whole. Don't sit back and say, well, this doesn't affect me. I was telling Sheila, I was in Chicago last weekend for a very important meeting between Ireland and New Zealand. It only lasted about 80 minutes, and unfortunately, Ireland lost the meeting. We won't talk about the red card that Ted Byrne got 3 minutes into the match. But anyways, I caught up with an old friend of mine who I hadn't seen, who I'd served on active duty with. He was an Air Force lawyer, really good lawyer. And he and I deployed together many years ago. And we've been very good friends ever since. And he's a black man in Chicago, married to a white woman. And so his two kids, his two beautiful kids, are biracial kids. And we were talking about ICE being in Chicago. And hearing him describe it is heartbreaking, you know. And you know, as a middle-aged white guy, at least I don't drive a minivan anymore, right? I'm not probably going to be pulled over and put face down in the road and cuffed and stuffed, right? And the stories that he was telling about his friends and his family and the people that he works with. So it's easy to sit and go, well, I'm good. But we need to strive for that change, not just in where we are, but where we live in society. We need to demonstrate this critical strategic and systems thinking. We need to solve these complex problems. You need to collaborate with others, seek continuous improvement, challenge the established status quo. Again, not you don't have to stand up and start yelling at the CEO in the board meeting. There's ways to do it. And then care deeply, deeply for others and strive to create just organizations. And I think that might be my last one. Courage is not a heroic moment, it's a spiritual discipline. Aristotle gave us the balance, it's the mean, right? Plato gave us wisdom, Mandela gave us fear transformed. Angelo and Lewis gave us virtue under pressure, but Ignatius gives us magis, discernment, purpose, and freedom. So, in closing, courage isn't a standalone thing or a standalone event. Courage is part of this leading 15 seconds at a time. Courage is building that skill so that you take the leadership, you take the courage, like I said, hand in glove, and you can use it in your daily lives and should be using it in your daily lives. Do you have the courage to do what's right? I'm sure you do. You just have to practice a little bit more so that when the time comes, which is fairly often, then you exercise that skill set. So, thoughts, questions, concerns? On time and under budget. All right.
All right, thank you so much.
I appreciate the applause. I will tell you, I was in the Philippines a few years ago and they gave me a standing ovation. They said 3 cheers and then they did hip hip hooray. So you guys, your spattering of applause is fine. I'm just saying you're way behind the Philippines.
Okay, you ready?
No.
Hip hip. Hip hip. There you go. That's courage. Okay. Thank you so much. I hope this was beneficial, food for thought, perspective. I hope you walk away, one, being motivated and energized, as was the intent for this meeting, to be a little bit more courageous. And what a wonderful session, Greg. Thank you so much for kicking this off. Much appreciated.
My pleasure.
And with that, please take some time, grab some food. Class starts. Well, you've got about 20 minutes to get to class if you have a class tonight. But we're grateful for Greg's expertise, leadership, and his good spirit that is shared with us tonight. Thank you so much, Greg.
Great, thanks. Thank you for being here, taking time out of your day.